Dear listeners, thanks for joining us again for The Foretop. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. And I'm so grateful to Erath for sponsoring this season of really important conversations about the wine industry. I had the great pleasure of sitting down with Erath head winemaker Leah Adent and chatting about winemaking and her travels and her career. We also speak about holiday menu planning, and I realize that we taped this right before Thanksgiving, so we'll be talking about Thanksgiving recipes. But guess what? We're talking about salmon, which is delicious any time of year. So stay tuned for that chat with Leah Adent. And if you've been listening, you know that Erath is offering a fantastic deal to our listeners. Just go to erath.com/theforetop for their special Foretop 3-pack. Use the promo code FORTOP, FOURTOP, to receive a 15% discount on any bottles you'd like to buy. That's all the way through the end of the year 2022. Thank you, Erath, for sponsoring the Foretop. And folks, if you want to taste with us, that Quail Run Pinot Blanc, Resplendent Pinot Noir, and Knight's Gambit Single Vineyard Pinot Noir, those wines were delicious. So would love to taste alongside you. Thanks. And now here's the show.
I want to tell you the story. A worker storms into his union leader's office and he says, "I've got this huge booger in my nose and management won't give me any tissue boxes," he shouts. And the union manager responds, "Maybe you should pick it."
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine and food world. I am your host, Catherine Cole.
And I'm your host, Martin Reyes, Master of Wine, with nice background birds for all y'all to feel a little bit more calm these days, because there's been so much breaking news in the world, you know, and some of it great, some of it not so great, all up and down. It's difficult to keep up. One of the topics that I've seen repeatedly over the past year is that of unionization.
Yeah, unionization. I feel like every day there's another news story about historic unionization efforts at companies like Amazon, Starbucks, Apple, Trader Joe's. The list goes on and on. And it got to the point where our senior producer, Izzy Kramer, was asking me about unionization in the wine industry, and I realized I had no answers for her. So we started looking up, is the wine industry unionized at all? We found some larger corporate wineries that have unionized employees. Listeners, if you want to check out that list, it's on the AFL-CIO website at aflcio.org/beer-wine. But I wanted to talk to some folks who have kind of been up close and personal with especially vineyard labor. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. But Martin, do you have any personal experience with unions? Any thoughts about this?
You know, Catherine, I personally do not have experience with the conversation around unionization in the wine industry. And I think that's kind of telling, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, our guests know a lot more about this than we do. So let's introduce them. Jade Marley wrote a fascinating article last year for Wine Enthusiast, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let me introduce her. She's a Brooklyn-based wine and spirits educator and a community organizer. She's the founder of the ABV Festival. She's also the founder of By the Hand Events, a distribution platform, and also By the Hand and Friends Wine Club. Welcome, Jade.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you.
And Miguel Lopez is also with us. He is a co-founder of an organization that Catherine and I are huge fans of. I'm thrilled to have Ivoy back in my sphere again. Ivoy, an organization based in Oregon that he can talk more about. Miguel is also the owner of Red Dirt Vineyard Management and Winemaking Company. It's an organization that is approaching vineyard management indifferently in Oregon. Miguel, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Totally honored to be here.
Well, can't wait to get into it. Jade, I mentioned the article you wrote for Wine Enthusiasts last year about labor and unionization in the wine industry. That is a hard word to say. And until I read your piece, I mean, it was just shocking to me. I did not realize that the National Labor Relations Act excludes farm workers. I had no idea. So can you tell me a little bit about what you learned about vineyard work and unionization?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to open up and acknowledge that I am only really a messenger, an observer, and a student. I do not do the hard work of getting into the soil and tending vines. And I have so much respect for the folks that do. And, so much respect for Miguel, who's really on the front lines of these issues. I work in trade, and what I'm really about is speaking about impact and speaking about issues that really we can tackle through wine, using wine as a vessel, using wine as a scope. And something that I learned that is just so important and really seems to draw people into this conversation is the fact that the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW, and their first kind of round of activations were in the vineyards, the Delano grape strike. Something that has really been important for me and keeps coming up kind of in my research and in conversations is this idea that first, before we even speak about unions, before we speak about labor movements and advocacy, we have to start at the foundation and stop divorcing grape growing from farming in general. It is just another leg of agriculture. And so for me, in using wine as a vessel, this is the most important thing we can speak about when presenting our end clients and our consumers with a bottle of wine. Is the first thing we need to talk about is how did these grapes get here? In doing the research for this article, as much as, the people whose perspectives made their way in there, I was speaking to all kinds of agricultural workers and advocates with the attempt to make it as rounded, holistic, and grounded as possible.
So true. So true. And you made a really good point, Jade. Until I started doing some reading for this episode myself, I didn't realize that one of the big major boycotts of the UFWs was the Gallo wine boycott. It lasted, 6 years. And you're right. It all started with laborers in grape vineyards.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that same spirit, if we look at what happened this past summer, we're in the year 2022, there was major movement out in California as far as like striking goes and organization. I don't want to say we haven't come that far, but we are not in a completely different set of conditions. And when we are fighting for the rights of grape growers, that does serve our interests directly as wine professionals. But ultimately, we're really trying to guarantee the rights for the people that give us what we need to survive.
Jade, you mentioned California, and it seems as though California and the federal government are on a boxing match, ping-ponging back and forth between what you referenced earlier about how the National Labor Relations Act excluded bargaining rights from farm workers, that then apparently the California legislature established that right, and then the Supreme Court that same year, whenever that was, right, made it like they kind of punched back, overruling what California had done, and then California came back and passed new legislation that expanded the union rights of farm workers. It's like, okay, there's messaging on both sides there, right? What's going on?
There's messaging and there's a lot of money. There's a reason why we keep bringing up California. And I mean, I could speak about this for days and all sorts of different conditions and lenses as to why California is that state. But vineyard owners tend to be wealthy, especially when we start to speak about these massive, farm operations. So the amount of money that is invested in making sure that the owners see a fat return on something that they typically don't have to put much physical labor into is really evident in what you just described, Martin, which is this ping pong match. Only people that have an incredible amount of money to feed into a lobby are able to go head to head with a Supreme Court like this. So it's also really essential to acknowledge the power dynamic and how much access to finances really plays a part in all of this.
Absolutely. And I think the most recent bit of news that's sort of interesting out of California is a law, AB 2183. Miguel and I were talking about this before we started recording, that the governor just recently signed, I believe in September or October of 2022. And it actually does give farm workers more rights in terms of joining unions. It allows them to mail in ballots to join unions and to vote in unions. And that is nice because That way, the farm owner isn't breathing down the neck of the farm worker. They don't feel like they're being intimidated. So California is definitely the state to watch in terms of rights. But Jade, I wanted to bring up something. You talked about the march that happened recently, and that march in August, from I think it was August 3rd to August 26th this past year. Farm workers marched across the Central Valley, covering 335 miles. They were repeating a march which you referenced, that took place in 1966. So it's like nothing has changed. It seems like farm workers barely have any more rights than they had more than 50 years ago.
It's archaic and it's stuck. And, before I toss it over to Miguel, because I'm really curious, what these events in California have kind of maybe influenced or rippled out into Oregon, I just really want to acknowledge the determination of these folks who walked hundreds of miles and ultimately, came out victorious. Like, that's an incredible feat. So really shout out to them.
Catherine, just circling back to your earlier comment about the bill in California, it just sounds reminiscent of Grapes of Wrath for me in terms of the union busters, but also intimidation. Just going down to vote. Also, just in your local election, it just feels like we're starting to see a lot of that come up more and more. And I think it's just residue from, I'd say, this is the previous administration and their openness to just be bullies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just unfair for everybody who's just trying to eke out. Jade, your comment right now hits home too. It's a matter of, it's just a different year and we're fighting the same fight, 50 years down the road. From the agricultural standpoint, it's a chess game. For every move that we make, the farm workers, laborers make, the farm owners counter.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that Martin referenced, California and the feds fighting back and forth. Same. Yeah, and then the deep pockets. I mean, yeah, it's a pretty real deal. So a good example, I just finished reading this year, Perilous Bounty by Tom Philpott, and in it he references the family that owns the Wonderful Group, and they have a huge holding in the Central Valley. And not only do they have a huge farm land holding, but they also control the aquifer there. They own, I think, somewhere in the range of 80% of that aquifer that feeds the rest of the valley. And so they've kind of, have a strong hold on that area. And yeah, they've got the pockets to go to great lengths with lobbying. So that just reminds me of that.
Mm-hmm.
So Miguel, it sounds like Oregon doesn't seem to have its own Fair Labor Practice Act. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but then our government quietly passed a bill in the spring that calls for agricultural employers to pay overtime.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, it was difficult to find any articles about this. And we only have 7 states that require that. California started this year. Washington phased in that requirement for 2024. What are your thoughts about this?
The best way I can describe it is, as a whole, agriculturally, we've gotten away with a lot over the years by not having to pay ag overtime. This is a question that I've had to answer multiple times over the years. And it's mainly come from curious people who don't toil under the sun or in the vines and who are curious to know, hey, so, these teams are working long hours, they must get some pretty cool overtime. I'm like, no, they don't. And they're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, why don't they? It's like, we're exempt from overtime rules. And they're like, what? And I go, yeah, we don't do it as a whole, but some of us do. Some of us have gone out and started doing it on our own because we think that's the right thing to do. But it's also a difficult component because we're working with such small margins to start with that if we were to layer that in, if we layer it in correctly, we can pass that cost on to our clients in a manner that isn't going to break the bank. We're getting better with each year. And also, I can speak from the Oregon wine industry. Some of us are going to be a little bit better at it than others, but as a whole, we think this is the right thing to do. Some companies are already doing it. Willamette Valley Vineyards started doing that, and I believe, I could be wrong, the Stoller Group does that as well. They pay overtime without having to have had this bill in place. And they also provide a bunch of other things, but it's a scale thing for them. They can afford to do most of that. Whereas a lot of the smaller growers, the 5, 10, 20 acre growers, they struggle to meet that component of it.
Miguel, I'm so glad you just brought up this issue, this concept, this point of scale. I work predominantly in, the natural wine sector where, it's common to really pride ourselves on caring for the land, caring for sustainability. But the farther I get into my career, the more that I realize that the sustainability is really addressed in a vacuum, and that, we speak about sustainability of the land without speaking about sustainability of the hands that are working the land. And a lot of, what kind of pulled me into this conversation is the fact that most of these vineyards that operate in this way, that ultimately wind up in this natural wine bottle, are not of scale to have a workforce that is sizable to unionize, or that is able to, pay overtime, because they're really small operations in and of, themselves. And at the same time, it leaves this wide open space for those who are greedy and those who recognize the opportunity to completely exploit their workers. We got rocked by a scandal in the summer of 2020 when a Southern Italian producer who said they were working on a small estate in Puglia actually wound up sourcing grapes from these huge operation that essentially was practicing indentured servitude. Mm-hmm. So this concept of scale, like if you say that you have a winery that is not large enough to, provide receipts on the way that they're treating their workforce, then the amount of wine that they're outputting should absolutely follow suit in order for that to be a valid argument. And I think that that's a really important point for consumers to start to wrap their heads around, if this is something that they care about, if this is something that they find themselves wondering, hey, how do I read this? The numbers have to match. You can't say you're a small organization. You can't say that you're a small winery, but then turn around and put out 20,000 bottles in a vintage. That math doesn't math. And ultimately, those numbers are skewed when it comes to compensating their labor force.
Jade, I'm so glad you brought this up, that story in Puglia. We did an episode, I think it was 97, called The Vineyard Stories You Haven't Heard, where with
Stephen Satterfield.
Stephen Satterfield and Deborah Parker Wong, in that story was one of the matchsticks for a lively conversation around this, in which we're talking about the rights of workers, fundamentally, right? That's pretty straightforward. Everyone knows this, but at the same time, what are the obstacles, discrimination and racism that's weaved in? We have built a system from all the way back from the Bracero program. The Bracero was this program in the 40s and 50s that, because of the labor shortage in World War II, brought in undocumented but under an agreement with the U.S. and Mexico, undocumented workers that then gave them temporary visas to fulfill the work in agriculture. And then that stopped in the 60s, but that momentum carried through, in which the undocumented workers kept coming through. So most of the vineyard workers that in the U.S., we should be clear, most of them are undocumented. So it would seem that they don't qualify for unionization. What are the avenues that they have for standing up for their own rights?
It's a difficult one to answer, Martin, because as a whole, agriculture has survived on cheap labor for close to 100 years. And the Rossetto program, while it was enacted in good faith, it wound up causing issues for those workers that were here, because now the farmers could turn around and say, well, I really don't want to negotiate or play with you guys. I'm just going to hire more Rossettos and make sure that they do the work that you don't want to do because you want an extra nickel
for cheaper, right?
Yeah, and so that continues to this day. We keep having those uphill fights every year. Mainly the biggest one being around harvest. So we pay in Oregon, the most common way of doing it is by piece rate, and by piece rate, it's filling a 5-gallon bucket to the top, and per bucket we're paying anywhere from, as a whole, from $2 up to $2.75, $3 when things get dire towards the end of the season and you're just trying to get crops off, the grapes mainly. And it pits us against each other. So unfortunately, we turn into a mad mob of different companies competing for the same worker, and we're all yelling out different prices, and the worker has the opportunity to go whatever direction they choose. But also it's kind of why are we biting each other when we could all be working together? And that's the difficulty of it for me. It's that we have this constant fight every year, and I think it's good for the worker, but it's also kind of dumb because if we had a set rate as a whole and we all agreed on it and it was a good rate as a whole, I think everybody would be able to work a little bit calmer, if that makes sense.
And Miguel, really, like, as you're speaking, the only word that keeps coming into my head is sustainable. That keeps coming to me as sustainable. Like, what you're describing is not a sustainable model. We all ultimately are working to achieve stability with dignity. And if we're scrambling around, fighting for each other, trying to see who's going to give you, a nickel more or not shave off or any of these things, you're sacrificing that sustainability to say, I know I can do this same exact thing tomorrow or even next year. And that really prevents you from building up a life of dignity, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
I do also want to add, because, I really admire what you do with Ayivoy. And as somebody who is in the industry in a very different capacity, which is strictly dealing with bottles and interfacing with people, I've witnessed a number of different producers attempt to remedy this in various ways. And I've encountered some producers who go as far as to present their vineyard management companies or the vineyards that they're working with contracts, saying, listen, I know this is nuanced. I know that there's not going to be any perfect model, but at the very least, I need to know that you are providing some sort of at least access, maybe not to healthcare, but to medical care, that you are paying a living wage in comparison to what the cost of living is around this vineyard, so that the people who are working your land can afford to live in a commutable area and is not tied to this land, so that they are able to go home to their families. And sometimes, you have to take it, as you were mentioning, Miguel, like, everybody has to be invested. It shouldn't all fall on vineyard managers. It shouldn't all fall on farmers to advocate for themselves. We're all benefiting from being in this industry, and there are various things that we can all advocate for in the space that we occupy. And I think for us, as wine professionals, we can ask these hard questions without being embarrassed or without feeling like we're virtue signaling. And as consumers, we can ask the people who are selling us these wines to vouch for that. The consumer probably has the most power in all of this, which is why, we're taking the time to inform and to discuss this in an open forum with the hopes that, consumers can take this information and really wield their power by asking the necessary questions.
Jade, you could have said it better. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We struggle with that as a whole, but also it's hard because the bigger you get when you scale up, the more you're producing, the more revenues coming in, the easier it gets to provide these components that you speak about, like health insurance, better living wages, better conditions for everybody. But not to say that it's all based on your scale. Some of that is, most of that you can already do. Like at my company, we saw years ago that we were running into unskilled labor out in the vineyards. And it's scary because over the years, the positions that I held at wineries, I would stick my nose in the vineyard because I grew up on doing that, and I went over to the winemaking side of the world, and I'm always curious to see how the vineyard teams are doing because based on their work and their skill sets and abilities, it determines whether or not we have a good season. And sometimes the vineyard management companies that we worked with, a van of workers would show up and they would all climb out, and the foreman for the vineyard management company would be there. And every once in a while, I would catch somebody saying, "Oh, wow, this is such beautiful view. I've never been to vineyard." And right away, my ears would perk up, and I would walk over and say, "Hey, good morning, everybody. How we doing? How many of you worked in a vineyard before?" And maybe one or two hands would shoot up. And to me, that was like, okay, cool. That to me lets me know that I need to switch the rest of my day around because, well, if we send a team out there that doesn't understand what they're doing, it has a big consequence on the productivity of that vineyard in that season. Not only does it have an adverse impact on this season, but it could potentially have an impact on the next season and the season after that. So that to me was something that came to my mind, and I said, well, shoot, this is a problem because if this continues, what's to stop people from just doing this all the time? Contractors mainly from doing this all the time, and so it inspired the need, the want to do this in terms of, well, we should build this company, we should hire the guys that we trust, but as we add to them, we should also teach them how to do this job properly, because this is a skill set. It's like a leather worker, it's like a shoemaker, it's like a plumber, it's like a framer. It's a skill set. If you know how to do this job, you're important. But if you don't know how to do this job, we should take the time to train you and make sure that you understand the whys of what you're doing, because it changes from site to site and from region to region.
I love that you said that, Miguel, because so often agricultural work is called unskilled labor. And I think, oh my goodness, it's probably the most skilled labor there is, right? Most people would not know how to do that kind of work.
Yeah, it takes years. When we teach somebody to prune, I'll use pruning as an example. We stick with that person for the first 2 or 3 seasons. We're constantly watching them and making sure that they're doing it right. It's almost, dare make this comparison, it's like being on the path to making sushi. You have to learn how to wash things properly for the first 3 years of your life, and then only then are you allowed to then start even thinking about helping make components to that process. It's once we see that you have enough base knowledge in doing it, we worry less about you. We still worry about you, but we worry less about you.
Miguel, I feel like you just brought up a really important distinction. And ultimately, like what we're speaking about is unions within wine, when they are essential, when it kind of tapers off, and why. And I feel like a big part of what you just said comes with care. If you care about the wine that you are making, if you are connected to the wine that you're making, if you are actually out in the vineyard, you see that investing in people ultimately is investing in your end product. If you treat your workers well, they in turn treat the land well, and good land makes great wine. On the opposite side, if you have a 500, 1,000, 1,500 acre farm, most of the time, I mean, I don't want to generalize, I don't want to, stereotype, but I think it's safe to say you can't cover that amount of land and touch the vines and interact with all of the people who are working that land. So there then becomes a little bit of a disconnect. And when you have a disconnect, when you have that window, in my opinion, that's when you need outside organizations, or that's when you need outside advocacy that can ultimately bargain directly with whoever is calling the shots. Because in that situation, who even knows who the boss is? Who even knows, who's signing the checks? There's so many layers of supervision in order to cover that amount of land. So I think it's really special, when you have somebody who's making the wine who also interfaces and goes out and see what's happening in the vineyards and is able to make those decisions. It ultimately makes better wine.
Hey, y'all. I just wanted to give you a heads up that the sponsor mid-roll you're about to hear was recorded before Thanksgiving, but it is delicious to listen to any time of year. Because you know what? I'm a pescatarian and I love salmon. So that said, enjoy. Hey there, listeners. We are once again joined by our much appreciated seasoned sponsor, Erath Winery, which is located in Oregon's Willamette Valley. And I am at the Erath Tasting Room in Portland's Pearl District with head winemaker Leah Adent. Now, Leah, you have been working Harvest and Crush, and I'm sure you've been bottling and labeling and doing winemaker dinners and all the things. So I don't know how you have time to entertain, but it is holiday season now, and I understand that you have some wine pairing suggestions for us for the holidays. And I understand you have some ideas about a Pacific Northwest style Thanksgiving that you might want to share with us.
Yeah. I mean, the tried and true turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes, it feels like the holidays, right? But there's always a good opportunity to branch out. And I think certainly in the Pacific Northwest, where we have local amazing seafood, and we have this feeling of being surrounded by pretty wild environment, and I think people gravitate towards that. So we put together a little menu of seared salmon and wild rice with mushrooms, a little earthy, a little Pacific Northwest, great to go with Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley, nice freshness, earthy flavors, kind of the best of both worlds.
You know, for those of you listening who are not Pacific Northwesterners, the classic Pinot Noir pairing is salmon, local
Absolutely.
salmon.
Yeah, you get that just light sear of the salmon, a little bit of char, but so fresh and juicy underneath. And that's kind of like a Pinot Noir, you know, you get some intense fruit and at the same time, nice earthiness, almost, you know, some of our wines are much more mushroomy than others. But nice acidity. It's a classic light pairing.
Yeah, and actually I noticed on this delicious menu that you put together, wild rice, mushroom, and hazelnut stuffing. Speaking of mushroomy, boy, those are good flavors with Pinot Noir. And hazelnut, you know, wild mushrooms are very local. And
absolutely.
A lot of them in Oregon and Washington. And hazelnuts are very much a Willamette Valley crop as well.
Absolutely. The filberts, that's a staple down here.
And you really can, I mean, regardless of your theories about terroir and what you're tasting when you're tasting the glass, you really can get those kind of hazelnutty, mushroomy flavors in a lot of Oregon Pinots.
Oh, yeah. Especially as they age, you know. We all kind of see the primary fruits and cherries and boysenberries when it's young, but getting a bottle that's 5 years old or 7 years old, or certainly once you're up to the 10-year-old range, those earthy, nutty, secondary flavors are one of the funnest things about Pinot Noir.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny when you said boysenberry, literally my mouth watered because I was looking at this menu, salmon, wild rice with mushroom and hazelnut stuffing, or with mushroom and hazelnut, garlic butter haricot vert. I was just thinking that sort of classic boysenberry flavor of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir goes so well with these kind of earthy, savory flavors.
Yeah.
It's just such a nice juxtaposition.
Yeah, we played with this recipe a couple times, and we actually took out a couple of things that might have been too sweet, like a sweet potato mash or something, just to keep it fresh, keep it nice and light. You know, we all have felt that tryptophan nap time after a turkey dinner, so this one's not going to do that.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's taste this wine.
All right.
And we have a single vineyard Pinot Noir here, correct?
We do. So this is our Knight's Gambit right at the top of the Dundee Hills. So this is one of the highest elevation vineyards in the Dundee Hills. It maxes out at about 950 feet elevation. So in a cool year, it does struggle to ripen at the very top, but it's a well-established, dry-farmed vineyard. It's honestly one of my favorite that we take fruit. It's probably my favorite that we take fruit from. It is 95% Pinot Noir. There's 5% Pinot Gris, actually, that we make a sweet harvest wine out of.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, but classic Dundee Hills soil, classic Dundee Hills flavors, big fruit, little bit of spice, nice earthy notes. I love this wine.
This wine is delicious. It's just so elegant. It's so Willamette Valley. It's you know, you can almost see through it. It's almost translucent.
You know, this vineyard, if not the last fruit that we bring into the winery, some of the last fruit. So it gets that hang time. It's budging up at the end of the season when people are tired and ready to be done, and your best fruit is coming into the winery. So it's, you know, it is that last hurrah of the harvest season, getting ready for Thanksgiving.
But there is nothing overripe about this wine. It's
No.
almost a little bit on the green side in a really delicious way, kind of a lip-smacking, like that acidity and that little bit of a catch that I can tell over time this wine is going to age beautifully.
Yeah, it's that acid hangs in there till
Yeah.
the very end. So
Yeah.
it's waiting for that to mellow out a little bit. It's waiting for the flavors to ripen. We're not looking to make a big wine of Knight's Gambit. It just takes its time, and you got to be patient.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, listeners, you are dying to taste this delicious Pinot Noir, and guess what? You can get a discount on it. So check out erath.com/thefourtop and enter the promo code FOURTOP, FOURTOP, to receive a 15% discount through December 31st, 2022. And that is good for any bottle purchase, as well as the very, very special Four Top 3-pack, which includes the Quail Run Pinot Blanc 2019, the Resplendent Pinot Noir 2019, and this very special wine from Erath, Erath's Single Vineyard Knight's Gambit Pinot Noir 2019. Well, we will be hearing from Leah one more time in our next regular episode of this wine season, so I can't wait to continue the conversation.
Jade, you've covered this topic earlier on. You touched on it, which is the very obvious way how sustainability, legitimate sustainability, extends into the human aspect, our people. And Miguel, you're building towards the diversity and the sustainability of our people. Supporting them eventually leads to retention, right? Leads to higher profits, it's less turnover and better quality work. Unionization is the next step for that, right? Where you protect the rights, you grow together in a community that is an essential workforce. For instance, I think last year there was something around the New York vineyard workers successfully unionizing. I think at Pindar Vineyards. Is it possible to replicate that? Jade, you've heard about this, right? Can you tell us what you've heard around the New York bill that passed?
Yeah, I first want to acknowledge that that is amazing. It's also the largest vineyard on Long Island. So again, we're speaking about scale, and necessity here. I don't want to discount communal efforts when you have a small winery and you have a small team and the idea is to grow together. I don't want to discount that because that kind of synergy and symbiosis is the most beautiful thing that occurs in this industry. That being said, again, when you have that layer, when it's not always direct contact between the people who are working the land and the people who are ultimately calling the shots, that's when this kind of middle layer is necessary. In New York, we do have a couple of very large vineyards. I do think that unionizing is essential for that. But even more so, I think we need to really concentrate on apple orchards, and pull them into this conversation. Especially, we're in a time when apple wine co-ferments are huge. And, depending on your region, depending where you are, is also going to affect scale. I really hope that efforts like what happened at Pindar is able, to get off of Long Island and go wider. This is a very recent event. I don't know. I don't see why it's not possible. I also really want to acknowledge the organizers who took the time out to approach these vineyard workers and really, give them that option. But again, I do not work in the vineyards and I do not want to speak for folks who I'm not directly in community with.
So, Miguel, can you speak about this from the vineyard perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Jade, again, you couldn't have said it better. It only works, this kind of unionization component only works if everybody comes to the table and agrees that it needs to be done for the betterment of everybody. What's that saying? All tides lift.
Rising tides lift all boats.
Rising tides lift all boats. That's what it needs to be. So for a number of years, and I laugh because this may or may not be funny. For a number of years, I would walk into our local ag supply store, and I got to know a couple of people at the front desk really well. And I would just randomly walk in and be like, "Hey, man, guess what happened today?" And they'd be like, "What?" And I go, "They unionized. The vineyard workforce unionized today. They're having their first union meeting down at the local carniceria in Lafayette." And the guys would look at me like, "You're kidding," and with a sense of like panic. And I would just, "No, I'm joking, man. I'm really joking." And I would do that,
wow.
but also as I got further along in my career and got to see more behind the scenes at higher levels of management, at higher levels in wineries, just based on the positions that I held and the access that I had to the wineries I worked for. At the end of the day, they're a business and they're here to provide a product and a service to tourists that then generates revenue for the company. I got to see more and more behind that, and I realized, there's a disconnect here. The VP of the company doesn't really understand what's going on at the ground level. Same way that generals in a war are in the rear with the gear, and it's the grunt on the front line that understands what's going on and can, if asked, can relay all of the real information to those higher ups. On the flip side of that, it also, in unionizing and talking about it, the workforce has to come to an agreement also that they're not going to undercut each other. We all agree to do this together, so we all have to play by the same rules. Because there are those groups within a group who are like, yeah, we'll do this together, and then turn around and just throw a grenade into all of this effort and work. And then that mistrust is brought back up to the surface. And it's hard because I want everybody to benefit from whatever we do collectively. But it sucks when a small group within the group decides to not want to play by those rules.
Miguel, you're making me think of the classic game theory problem, the Byzantine generals problem, which for some reason that's come up a number of times this week, where you can never trust other groups who may have other motivations to all fight for the same cause or stick to the same line. But you know what I wanted to ask you, Miguel, is you've mentioned a little bit your own business, Red Dirt, and you've tried to create a new vineyard management company that just goes about the business differently. And I wondered if you could just sort of outline your approach.
So our approach was to, right off the bat, pay our team more per hour. And by doing that, it kept us from having to worry about them not showing up to work. It ensured that they were making more per hour because that's what they deserve. They've earned it. I mean, their efforts, you can see them year in, year out. It was a reminder to me that if you are paying minimum wage and having grown up the son of immigrants who worked in these vineyards, you're not making ends meet at minimum wage on a job like this. It's just not possible. So those were the motivators. But also for me, it's the loyalty that we were able to build with our teams by being on the ground as well. And we've done that. We've done that successfully. I mean, we are now going into season number 6, 7, and we're looking to continue to add more people to the team. The downside that I have seen is that we are having to fight for workers in a smaller work pool. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I was gonna ask Jade. You know, in the beginning, we were kind of talking about how not much progress has been made since the 1960s. But Miguel, hearing your story, I'm feeling like there is some progress.
I think it's really important to distinguish structural and systemic progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely, Jade.
that's true.
I mean, I can also name a couple of really beautiful, romantic wine stories that if they were, you know, taking place in Burgundy, they would be written about in every damn wine book. But because we're speaking about, you know, folks that came from parents who were migrant workers from Mexico and Central America, their stories aren't considered as glamorous. But this is absolutely the exception at this point. And we really have to focus on structural and systemic change, even while appreciating these really beautiful, you know, moments and exceptions, I think. And that's not to minimize anything. I think it's beautiful, but it's not a common occurrence. And as Miguel has mentioned several times, like farming is not really something that we see people returning to generation after generation. That's domestic and abroad. And I think a big part of that is because, you know, there has to be dignity in work for people to want to do it. If we're working to give next generation options and access, we have to make this a viable option for people to be farming. We need farmers. We need farmers. I mean, wine is really special in that it's an agricultural based industry that ultimately results in a luxury product. So we have the ear of some pretty financially empowered people. So in my opinion, this wine industry continues to be one of the best industries and avenues to affect change in the agricultural sector across the board.
Well, that seems like a beautiful point to move on to our dessert wine course, where we each share something just maybe unrelated that we've just been enjoying this past week.
I love hybrids. I feel like
you're such a New Yorker. Such a New Yorker.
I love hybrids. I feel like when we're speaking about this intersection of social and environmental sustainability, especially in the wake of climate change, something that's really important to acknowledge is that when you have a product, when you have a base product that you are trying to grow and you have an agricultural product that doesn't necessarily match the climate and the environment in which it is grown, you have to beat it into submission. Oftentimes that can mean emitting more carbon. It could mean using more water. What it also means is that it's more intensive labor for whoever is working that land. So for me, my work is really focused on the intersection of social and environmental and, I mean, really economic sustainability. My work is really focused on a way way to live a holistic life across sectors. And what I see as having the most potential to really get us there is looking at these hybrid grapes that are both, palatably pleasing to end consumers, but ultimately make the work of growing that much easier. So it's all I want to talk about. Like, we got to get behind hybrids. We got to pull them into every conversation, because if they're not the answer, they can bring us there.
Yes, I agree. There's some really, really delicious hybrid wines, and people poo-poo them because they're not quote unquote noble. You know what? The word noble just needs to be thrown out.
The word noble is really a symptom of supremacy. These grapes are not from here. We have grapes that are from here and do fine.
Yes.
And additionally, I think that it's important for us to understand, if we were served orange juice, the most delicious, dense, concentrated orange juice, but we were expecting to drink grapefruit juice, we would think that orange juice was flawed as well. It's a matter of understanding that we have to recalibrate our chemistry to have a more open approach and open mind to accepting different forms of ferments, grape-based and otherwise. And they don't all have to taste like Vitis vinifera. They don't all have to taste like the grapes you're familiar with. That's what makes wine beautiful and interesting. It is in constant evolution and flux.
Oh my gosh, I have a whole other episode now forming in my brain, Jade. Thank you so much. You got me thinking.
People, we've just scratched the surface here on this particular subject. May I just say, I know we're in the dessert course, but I wanted just to emphasize that point.
Yeah, it's been really good to have this conversation. It just takes that one person to say, hey, let's try this out and see what happens.
Totally.
A good example, I just had a Textura Sauvignon Blanc the other night. One, I grow grapes for them, and it's a small plus Sauvignon Blanc in the Old Amity Hills. But two, the wine was just amazing. It was beautiful. I don't think we could have done that 20 years ago. And only going back 10 years, we couldn't have done that either. It's only been recently that we can grow and ripen those varietals to a point where it's like, yes, we can make delicious wines from this. So that was my dessert wine that I've had.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome.
That's good stuff. Can you repeat the name of the winery?
Yes.
Yeah.
Textura. So it is Tekstura. Textura wine in the Old Amity Hills. Very new company, amazing family, really good people. They're a good example of, in my opinion, new ownership that's coming to the Willamette Valley that is paying attention and cares about the whole process. Not to say that there are owners that don't. Everybody does. But because it's such a small production and an amazing vineyard site.
And the eel at Amity Hills is my favorite sub-appellation of the Willamette Valley. Can I jump in with my dessert wine course? Because what Miguel said reminded me of the phrase "si se puede," which this is the famous farm workers cry, and of course President Obama kind of stole it for his campaign. His campaign being "Yes, we can." And I wanted to point out, Cesar Chavez, of course, is famous as the leader of the United Farm Workers, but I wanted to point out that Dolores Huerta, who I believe is still with us and is still marching, and I think she's in her 90s, was the one who actually came up with that term, si se puede. There's a wonderful documentary about her. It's a PBS documentary, but you can see it on other channels. It's called Dolores, and it was actually produced by the musician Carlos Santana, who, of course, I love his music. So I had to watch it, and she was the most sort of dynamic person, or still is the most dynamic person, and just so fierce, so stubborn, always has kind of a twinkle in her eye and a smile on her face. Somehow she had 11 children while also leading this huge movement starting in the 1960s. If you're looking for something to watch, Dolores, it's an amazing documentary. And then I have a dessert on my dessert course, which is if you're in San Francisco, tune into KQED and listen to my old friend Farida Jabala Romero. She is the labor correspondent, and I actually cheated and emailed her before this episode. And she gave me some ideas. So she's an amazing reporter. So I wanted to give a shout out to her. Martin, what is your dessert wine course?
Napa Green. I want to point out the Napa Green certification on the back of the bottle because it is one of the few leading certifications of sustainability in wine that also includes social equity as part of its standards. and part of the threshold to actually achieve the certification. And I'm proud to be a board member of Napa Green because that part matters. So in the spirit of that, I wanted to point that out.
That's awesome.
Thanks to our amazing guests for joining us. You can learn more about Miguel Lopez's work with AIVOY at aivoyoregon.org.
You can learn more about Jade Marley's work at jademarley.com, and that's JAHDEMARLEY.com. And hey, you can check out napathrives.org, which is actually the event that Napa Green put on and which we invited a speaker. AIVOY was down here for that. Miguel, I'm sure you knew about that.
Sampara.
Sam Parra came down.
Yep, Sam Parra.
You can also find me, Martin Reyes, MW, at reyeswinegroup.com and winewise.biz, my import company.
And you can find me, Catherine Cole, at catherinecole.com, or even better, please head on over to theforetop.org where you can find our social media handles and let us know what you thought of the episode. We want to hear from you about what you think about the state of labor in the vineyards.
Signing out from the Napa Valley, thanks so much for listening, everyone.
And signing out from the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, bye-bye.
This has been the Four Top Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Izzy Kramer is our senior producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor Michelle Richards, editorial assistant Nick Toole, and media assistant Ruby Welkovich. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.